All right, so I am recording for your flipped lessons on the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to start with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement right now, looking at the origin of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, known as the SCLC, particularly Martin Luther King's role in the SCLC, and we'll be looking at the changing role of the government in relation to civil rights. So I'm not going to click on the link for the Montgomery bus boycott. So you can pull up my PowerPoint through my website, and this will take you to a YouTube video that actually shows Martin Luther King talking about the bus boycotts. Understand, Rosa Parks is a very important person in this process. Okay, it is her decision not to give up her seat on the bus. Her subsequent arrest that leads to the Montgomery bus boycotts, where the people of Montgomery, Alabama, refused to ride on the bus. And this goes on for about a year. And so this is really Brown v. Board happens in 1954. This is going to happen in 1957, I believe. And so you're going to see that this is kind of a natural progression of Black Americans standing up for their rights. Understand that Alabama had been horribly segregated and was not, Blacks there did not have the same education. They worked, their pay was unequal. The community was very clearly against integration, although the businesses there didn't really mind that Blacks shopped at their places. So one of the things that happens with the Montgomery bus boycotts is not only the effect that it has on the city bus company, but also the effect that it has on businesses downtown. Because if Blacks can no longer, they're not riding the bus to get downtown to shop at stores, that means they're not spending money. And so one of the aspects of this Montgomery bus boycott is that it changes the way Blacks in Montgomery, Alabama are spending their money. So Rosa Parks, she takes her seat on the bus and decides not to give it up. One of the interesting things about Rosa Parks is that when this had been done before by a couple of other people in Montgomery, Alabama, or around the South, maybe not Montgomery specifically, but certainly this was not a completely new concept to Rosa Parks. Now, that's not to diminish that she chose not to give up her seat, that she decided she was tired of it, and she was willing to take that next step. Just understand that there had been other cases where people had done the same exact thing. What's different about Rosa Parks is that Rosa Parks is very much kind of that paragon of virtue, right? She is a hard-working woman. She's a community leader. She's not a troublemaker. She is this kind of person that's the epitome of the kind of citizen you would want. And so when she chooses to take the step herself, what will happen is that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the other Black community members and her church, most importantly, don't forget the role of Black churches in these southern cities, will really kind of take this kind of stand and take it into the Montgomery bus boycotts and really change the civil rights movement. She was an active member of various organizations, and she was an activist. It's not like she had just been working and not paying any attention. She had been an activist for a number of years, but she has on this one day, she's decided it's enough, and she's not going to do it anymore. The Rosa Parks and her refusing to give up her seat is a part of the effect of challenging the Plessy v. Ferguson and the segregation rules that we've seen building from the court cases we talked about this week, last week, depending on when you're listening to this. Keep in mind that it's not just that the court cases don't just begin out of nowhere. Okay, understand, and if you think back to when we talked about Blacks migrating from the South up to the North because of the need for jobs and the opportunities that were happening because of the Great Migration and the World War I era and that kind of thing, and how that created kind of cultural communities up north. What you're going to see is that you're going to have black political power being consolidated in these black neighborhoods. So you can have a community in Harlem, you can have a community, and I can't think of the ones in Chicago or Detroit, that can really kind of vote as a block. And we talked about block voting when we talked about immigrant voting and political machines and that kind of thing. So kind of keep that in mind. And remember that around FDR, before World War II, you have that Democratic coalition that he creates where Democrats begin to be more than just those Southern Democrats. It includes blacks, it includes progressives, it includes all these other people. So just keep that in mind, that this is all a part of this transition that's happening that leads us to the Civil Rights Movement. The NAACP had begun challenging through the court system and challenging successfully as early as 1935. And again, this is going to be because you have Black Americans who fought in World War I, you have Black Americans who fought in World War II, you have the New Deal kind of trying to bring blacks into the Democratic Party. And you can see that you have some early cases there that begin to change the way blacks are how they're allowed to participate in schools, how they can travel on buses, and the exclusion from juries, that kind of thing. The big court case you need to understand here is the Sweat v. Painter one that we've talked about in class. And I will mention briefly this idea about ending segregation on interstate buses. This will matter a lot when we talk about the Freedom Riders in the early 1960s. These are blacks and whites who will ride on buses that travel from the north into the south, to really kind of stand up and draw attention to the fact that in the South, even though you had court cases that said you could not segregate, if a bus or a vehicle or train or anything is going from one state to another state, that's called interstate travel, that falls under the purview of Congress and the Supreme Court. And so you have this ruling here that says they can't segregate on those buses, but once these buses would get into Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina, they would then enforce segregation. And so the Freedom Rides will challenge that. So you might kind of stick that in the back of your head. You also have, as early as 1942, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, created by James Farmer, who's a Texan, began to use sit-ins to protest segregated restaurants and theaters. They're also they began to develop some kind of momentum with black soldiers and military guys. So understand that as early as in the midst of World War II, and think about the Tuskegee Airmen and how blacks were fighting to be an equal partner in the military, and they stand against these segregations all around. Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, he is a part of that. He refuses to move to the back of the bus when he's when he's in the military, and so you have this momentum building by the 1940s. And of course, if you remember from the court cases, many of these cases begin to start really kind of catch national attention in the 1940s. Don't forget, in 1948, Truman desegregates the armed forces. That's an important detail. And so you really begin to see these changes happening. So Brown v. Board will desegregate the schools, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson in 1954, which we've already talked about. And one of the things that's going to happen, and we'll see that the South will really kind of freak out over the Brown v. Board ruling. In fact, you actually have to have a Brown v. Board 2 ruling that kind of clarifies exactly what the Supreme Court meant, which you wouldn't think it had to be clarified, but it does. And what this should tell you is that the South is not going to change easily. And if any of you are familiar with, Ferguson, Missouri, or racism that still exists today, you know that there are places in the South that really struggle with this concept of equality, especially social equality, and changing people's hearts and minds. Because just because you have a Supreme Court ruling does not mean that people are going to say, "Oh, okay, everything's fine now." It's going to take generations to undo hundreds of years of racism. So the South, they do all kinds of tricks trying to, and we talked about this some when we talked about Delgado v. Bastrop and how Texas, tried to reorganize classrooms based on English language acquisition and how well these Hispanic kids could speak English, and so you're going to have some of the same stuff happening in the South. And you're also going to see, most notably, and don't forget this, Southern members of Congress will really come out against the Supreme Court. They will come out against all kinds of, of any kind of effort to create equality. So the Southern Manifesto is very important. And understand that you had similar actions after the recent gay marriage ruling, where you had people coming out and saying, oh, the Supreme Court has abused its judicial power. And so basically the Southern members of Congress will encourage states in the South to resist integration, even though the Supreme Court has unanimously said this is the law of the land. And so there's going to be resistance and pushback, and it takes a couple more decades before we finish kind of fixing this because, like I said, the southern states are not going to want to comply. So what you're going to see is that the bus boycott is kind of becomes its own thing. Like, it starts off as just kind of this brief boycott for a couple of days, and you're going to see that that part of it's going to be, a response to her resisting the 1956 Supreme Court ruling that allows that within states they can control, like, where people sit and that kind of thing, which is kind of shocking considering they just finished talking about, public schools should be integrated. In 1956, the Supreme Court says, well, if the transportation's on a city bus, the city can decide what it wants to do with its own locality. And so she stands up for this, and this whole thing, this Montgomery Improvement Association, will start to extend this boycott over, more and more and more. And the interesting thing about this is you're going to have this organization of black churches that will then create these carpools and these systems that will replace the busing system. You'll have growth within black businesses because people aren't shopping at white businesses. And so this boycott is actually much bigger than blacks not riding the bus. And understand this takes place over the course of a year. So this is a long period of time for people to be walking back and forth to work. And you just need to appreciate. Imagine if you had to walk back and forth to work or back and forth to school every single day. And you had people that were walking miles and miles, and so that is a huge turning point. So part of what has to happen with the Montgomery bus boycott, since the Supreme Court was not able to overturn it within itself, right? So it's not like Brown v. Board where they say, okay, this is not fair, this is not right, can't be the law of the land. Because this involved a city location, they have to work within the city to make the city change the rules. And so that's where the power of the bus boycott comes from, as you have the Montgomery Improvement Association and then later the SCLC and all these other groups coming in and really changing the laws themselves rather than just having to rely solely upon the Supreme Court. So what you start to see beginning with the bus boycott is not just the legal challenges to racism and segregation and that kind of thing, but other challenges that are meant to challenge laws where they exist. Be sure you understand who Martin Luther King Jr. is. Most of you probably have a pretty good concept. He gets talked about quite a bit throughout your school career. Keep in mind he was a minister. Keep in mind he was, a leader in his community, because as a minister, black churches are incredibly important in these communities, especially during this period of the 50s and 60s. And he's influenced by Gandhi and this idea of civil disobedience and nonviolent passive resistance, that basically a law that is unjust should not be followed, and that to follow an unjust law is basically to endorse that. And so this is kind of where we begin to see things changing and developing. Now, he emphasizes unity within the black community. He also emphasizes that the ultimate goal of ending segregation is to have unity within America. So one of the pieces of his message is that blacks and whites are going to get along, they're going to live together, and they're going to coexist and work together for a stronger country. Now, that's important to understand because there's going to be other groups later on that are going to be not quite as interested in that. and they're going to want to talk about black power and standing up, for black rights and that kind of thing. Also understand that one of the things that will happen, because he emphasized blacks and whites living together and making this country great, and having this sense of equity and fairness across, races, some people kind of water down some of the things that he does. And they make him sound far more like he's a accommodationist, that he's, willing to work with whatever system's in place. And that's not exactly true either. So understand that his legacy can have different interpretations depending on who's doing the talking. So the SCLC is incredibly important in organizing these nonviolent protests. So we're going to leave Martin Luther King and focus instead on how the Brown v. Board case develops. So you're going to see that that Eisenhower, who was president in the 1950s, so think about that, he doesn't like the Brown v. Board ruling. He disagrees with it because he feels like the country's not ready for it. He feels like it's going to create some violence. But he ultimately decides that it's his role as the president to enforce the law. And if you remember us talking about the different responsibilities given to the different branches of government, one of the things we talked about is that the president is in charge of enforcing laws. And so with Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, they decide that they're going to integrate the school. This is, 3 years after the first Brown v. Board. I think it's like 1 year or maybe close to that with Brown v. Board 2. And basically, Arkansas is refusing to admit black students, so they have to have a court order that says you have no choice, you have to do this. And basically, the Arkansas governor, who I believe is Orville Faubus, don't quote me on that, let me double check it. Anyways, he stands up against this integration and basically says that what he wants is, and it was Orville Faubus, thank you. So basically he says that he's not going to comply with this court order, and he basically says that he's going to put the National Guard around there to keep these black students from entering. They get a whole mob of people. And so what will happen is that Eisenhower will interfere and say, no, I'm going to send Army troops in, and they're going to make sure these kids go to school. So you have the Little Rock, Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine, as kind of one of the first real tests of the Brown v. Board ruling. And what you see is that Eisenhower comes in on the side of that. It's exerting the power of the federal government over the states, right? It's exerting the power of the president over a governor. And so you have this process by which Brown v. Board really gets enforced. And then shortly after this, you're going to see that under Eisenhower's administration, they're going to create a Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now, don't confuse this with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This one's very different. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it is important that you understand we have these baby steps of moving from the creation of the NAACP to the Great Migration and the cultural developments of the 1920s, to having soldiers fighting in World War I and World War II, to having emerging court cases and emerging political power, to ultimately having this end of school segregation that will lead to kind of a momentum for groups like Martin Luther King's group to start challenging laws where they exist instead of just simply allowing the Supreme Court to do it. And then you're going to have the President of the United States clearly coming in and saying, no, federal government's in charge. We're going to tell you how to do this. And they create this Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice specifically to identify cases where where states or entities aren't following civil rights. Remember, by the time you get to 1957, we've had a lot of court cases that establish, that segregation's not okay. Court cases about, juries and about schools and about transportation. And so they create this division within the Department of Justice specifically to study this and have a good concept of what's of how everything works. So this is the first Civil Rights Movement lecture. I'm going to stop this and save it, and I will pick up with the second one.